One of the most talked about social experiments to date is Milgram's obedience experiment, better known as the Milgram Experiment. While the methodology used in this experiment is considered highly unethical by today's standards of conduct, at the time no one thought to consider the intense emotional toll this experiment would take on participants. What's most interesting about this experiment is not exactly the unethical nature of it, but rather the conclusions that can be drawn from the results. The experiment essentially provides real observable evidence of the ease in which perceived authority figures can sway ordinary people with strong moral codes to inflict pain upon others. Despite the notoriety of this experiment, the outcome of the study made such an impact in the field of psychology that it earned Stanley Milgram, the designer of said experiment, an award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1965. Stanley Milgram himself was born in 1933 in New York City to Jewish parents Adele and Samuel Milgram. They were immigrants from Eastern Europe that had fled their home during World War I. When the Second World War rolled around, Milgram and his immediate family were living in New York, whilst his extended family had remained in Eastern Europe. As you can imagine, being a Jewish family during the time of the Holocaust, many of his family members suffered severely at the hands of the Nazis, and many bore the tattoos branded on them in concentration camps, never allowing them to forget the tragedy they had gone through. Milgram would recall that whilst he was a child, his parents often sat listening to the radio to hear any developments about the war and the fates of their family. In a 1974 interview, Milgram speaks about his boyhood, where he spent most of his time doing experiments. For him, it was as natural as breathing. As a teenager at James Monroe High School, he assisted in stagecraft and theatrical productions, an experience that undoubtedly inspired the dramatic elements that were used in his obedience experiment. Coincidentally, one of Milgram's classmates at James Monroe High School was Philip Zimbardo, whom some of you may know as the designer of the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, another highly controversial but highly impactful social experiment. After graduating from high school, Milgram earned a degree in political science at Queens College and went on to earn a PhD from Harvard University in social psychology when he was 27 years old. When receiving his PhD in Harvard, he was taught by two giants of American psychology, Gordon Allport and Solomon Asch, the latter whose work inspired Milgram to design and carry out his own social experiment. In 1961, he married his wife Alexandra, and they went on to have both a daughter and son. Milgram's interest in the concept of obedience and authority was unquestionably fueled by the events of the Holocaust. Thomas Blas is an American social psychologist, Holocaust survivor, and professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Maryland. Blas is also the author of the 2004 book, The Man Who Shocked the World, The Life and Legacy of Stanley Milgram, the first biography of Milgram ever published. He refers to Milgram's lifelong identification with the Jewish people as the basis for his interest in the Holocaust, and thus the desire to construct and carry out this study. As a reasoning for the experiment, in 1977 he said, "The experiment gave scientific expression to a more general concern about authority, a concern forced upon members of my generation, in particular upon Jews such as myself by the atrocities of World War II." He pointed out that the impact of the Holocaust on his own psyche energized his interest in obedience and shaped the particular form in which he was to examine it. From a very young age, Milgram's concerns for his fellow Jews suffering at the hands of the Nazis were prominent. The year following the end of the Second World War, he gave a very well put together and heartfelt speech during his bar mitzvah when he was 13 years old. He's reported as saying, "As I come of age and find happiness in joining the ranks of Israel, the knowledge of the tragic suffering of my fellow Jews throughout war-torn Europe makes this also a solemn event and an occasion to reflect upon the heritage of my people, which has now become mine. Solomon Osk was a prominent social psychologist whose area of interest was in conformity. His experiments in conformity provided major contributions to the field of social psychology. A typical experiment would involve the placement of one participant in a group of accomplices pretending to be other participants. The group is then given 2 cards to view, one showing 3 straight lines and the other showing 1 straight line that's the same length as the others. The participant was always placed last, and the accomplices were instructed to answer incorrectly to observe whether their blatantly wrong answers would sway the participant's answer. Osk found that on average, the real participant often conformed to the majority, providing the obviously wrong answer. After helping Osk with his conformity experiments, Milgram decided to design an experiment that would make Osk's experiment more humanly significant. He said, "I was dissatisfied that the test of conformity was judgments about lines. I wondered whether groups could pressure a person into performing an act whose human aspect was more readily apparent, perhaps behaving aggressively towards another person, say by administering increasingly severe shocks to him." He wanted to know how someone would act without any group pressure, and he zeroed in on this experimental control, with the question of just how far would a person go under the experimenter's orders. As summed up in the article Perils of Obedience, written in 1974, he wrote that he set up this experiment to test how much unnecessary pain an ordinary citizen could inflict upon another person simply because he was ordered to do so by an experimental scientist. The authority figure was pitted against the participants' strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and despite the participants' ears ringing with the screams of the victims, the authority figure won more often than not. Milgram conducted his experiment at the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University, where he also taught as a professor. The participants were all gathered using newspaper ads and direct mail solicitation. They recruited 40 males aged between 20 and 50 years old, residing in the greater New Green Haven area. They were all from different occupations, ranging from corporation presidents to plumbers. There were ones who hadn't even finished elementary school, and also ones that had doctorates. When the participants arrived and were duly paid for their participation, they were informed that they had no responsibility to complete the experiment, and they would be compensated regardless of their withdrawal. Once they agreed to proceed, they were paired with another participant, who was actually an accomplice of the experimenter. The pair were then informed that the aim of this experiment was to learn more about memory. More specifically, they wanted to understand how people learned various types of material. The instructor refers to a book on the table, written by a social psychologist who theorized that people learn things more correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake. He goes on to say that there's a lack of scientific research into the effects of punishment on learning, hence why this experiment is being carried out. The participants were told that some of them would be placed in the role of teacher, and some would be the learner. However, the draw to select the roles was rigged in such a way that the participant always selected the teacher role and the accomplice always received the learner role. In some iterations of the study, the accomplice is never seen, while in others, the participant and the accomplice are in the same room. In the version of this experiment that's most commonly known, the learner is taken into a room along with the participant, where the equipment is put on and the learner is given instructions. It's at this point that the learner mentions a small heart issue he had years ago, which shouldn't cause any problems, but he wanted to inform the experimenter just in case. Then the participant is taken into another room, where a machine sat with loads of buttons displaying different voltages. They were told that the machine generated electric shocks that range between 30 to 450 volts. As a general rule of thumb, anything above 110 volts with enough current is considered to be lethal. The instructor explains that when a switch is pulled down, the learner on the other side of the room receives an electric shock, and when the switch is released, it stops. A sample shock is given to the participant, and they were asked to estimate the number of volts. One participant estimated it to be 75 volts when it was actually 40 volts. The experiment starts, and the participant reads out a list of words to the learner, which the learner has to memorize and reply back using a switch that shows the participant which answer they chose. If the learner were to give the correct answer, the participant was to move on to the next question, and then the next question, until the entire list was finished. If the learner gave the incorrect answer, the participant was to give him an increasingly high voltage shock each time he answered incorrectly, until the entire list was finished. Obviously, the learner was an accomplice, meaning that no one was actually receiving any electrical shocks. There were many dramatic elements used during the experiment to convince the participants of the legitimacy of the learner and his suffering. The learners were also instructed to give as many wrong answers as they possibly could. During the study, they would start to yell out of pain at around 110 volts, saying things like, "Ow, let me out of here, my heart is bothering me." The learners' cries of pain would get increasingly more intense as the experiment went on. One participant, after hearing the learner yell out, "I can't stand the pain, let me out of here," and knowing he had complained earlier about a heart trouble, turned to the experimenter and said, "I'm not going to kill that man in there." To this, the experimenter replied with, "As I've said, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous." Throughout the study, the experimenter never said anything to the participant, apart from encouraging them to go on. When the participants asked what happened to him, the instructor would merely say, "The experiment requires you to continue." After the participant protested and refused to be held responsible for the learner getting hurt, the experimenter tells them that he is the one responsible for anything that happens to the learner, so to please continue with the experiment. Following this exchange, the participant gives the learner a 300-volt shock. At this point, the learner expresses his disdain and refuses to answer any more questions. Puzzled, the participant turns to the experimenter and shrugs. The experimenter urges him to consider non-answers as wrong answers and to follow the punishment procedure. With more grit, the participant asks again, "Do you accept all responsibility?" To which the experimenter replies, "The responsibility is solely mine. Please go on." The participant then goes on to give the learner a 450-volt shock, the highest voltage shock generated by the machine. Thinking that the experiment is now over, the participant once again turns to the experimenter and states that they should check on the learner. He's told that he must continue until the list is finished. Defeated, the participant rests his head in his hands and shocks the learner one last time. This is the hardest parts to watch about the footage of the experiment. We can clearly see that some of these participants were men with good morals and a good conscience, clearly worried and anxious about the learner's well-being. Despite the contradictory nature of these thoughts and feelings, however, they obeyed this authoritative man in a lab coat, which absolved them of all responsibility, and were easily persuaded by him to give strong electrical shocks to another man, all while forgetting that their roles could have been easily reversed. At the end of this experiment, when participants were asked how they felt, they described distress at having to continue shocking the learner well after he had been silent for a while. When asked who actually pulled the switch, they justified their actions by saying that the experimenter kept insisting and would not let them stop. On the bright side, some participants outright refused to go on with the experiment after hearing the learner yell out in pain for the first time. When some were told as a last resort that they did not have any choice but to continue with the experiment, they replied with a stern, "Yes, I do." One of the main and important criticisms of the study has to do with ethical concerns. Many who heard about the experiment thought that it was highly unethical to immerse these individuals in these highly stressful situations without informing them and having prior consent. Although this deception about the true nature of the experiment was necessary to observe the true behavior of individuals in such situations, the participants were nevertheless actively deceived, leaving the ones that went up to 450 volts believing wholeheartedly they had hurt an innocent human being. It's relieving to know that a year after the experiment, Milgram followed up with the participants to check on their psychological well-being, and most said they were happy to have taken part in the study. Another example of criticism towards this experiment is the heavily biased sample of participants. Milgram only recruited male participants for this study, which means the results are not exactly generalizable to the whole US population. In addition to that, since the participants were recruited using newspaper ads, they may have had a volunteer personality, which may have determined the extent to which they were able to go along with the experimenters' instructions. "40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school were asked to predict the performance of 100 hypothetical subjects in an experiment such as this. They predicted that only 1% of the participants, so only one person out of 100 people, would administer the highest shock on the board, but in reality, a staggering 50% of the participants obeyed the experimenter's instructions and went all the way up to 450 volts. In total, Stanley Milgram conducted 19 different experiments with varying conditions on obedience. In further experiments, Milgram attempted to analyze the factors that contribute to the force of the situation. He wanted to play with the different elements of this experiment to see whether they would make a difference in the level of obedience displayed by the individuals. For instance, in one condition, the learner could not be seen or heard, but pounding on the wall could be heard at 300 volts. In another condition, the learner could be heard but not seen, which was the version we just discussed. In a third condition, the learner was in the same room as the participant. In another, the learner's hand rested on a shock plate. At 150 volts, the learner refused to put their hand on the plate anymore, at which point the participant was instructed to physically force their hand back onto the shock plate. Milgram discovered that obedience dropped significantly as the victim was in closer proximity to the participant, indicating that it would be much less likely to be able to persuade an individual to inflict pain on others the closer they are to the victim. A substantial number of participants in these experiments had powerful emotional reactions, such as tension, emotional strain, experiencing trembling, sweating, biting lips and nails. 3 participants experienced uncontrollable seizures, most likely due to stress. Many went into laughing fits due to nervousness, and went out of their way to point out they weren't sadistic, just incredibly tense. It should be noted that those who did go to the end of the board are not sadistic either. Considering the context of their actions is important. These individuals were placed in a situation that was bigger than them, with seemingly little control over anything going on. In relation to that, the implications that can be drawn from the results of this study are a little bit disturbing. The most unsettling implication is that human nature cannot be counted on to prevent people from brutal and inhumane acts and the treatment of others under the command of malicious authority. A substantial number of people will simply do what they're told to do, irrespective of the content of the acts and without much of a burden on their conscience, as long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate figure of authority, and as long as they're absolved of responsibility. In the aftermath of this experiment, quite a lot of people were baffled and angry at the amount of stress the participants must have endured throughout the study. Milgram received harsh criticism on how unethical this experiment was, thus changing the way psychological experiments were designed and conducted in the future. They would be designed in such a way that would cause the least amount of physical or psychological harm possible. Has Milgram's experiment managed to explain how average, ordinary German citizens could be transformed into individuals who would perpetuate unimaginable acts of cruelty against the Jews of Europe, resulting in the death of 6 million of them? In 1974, he wrote, "The ordinary person who shocked the victim did so out of a sense of obligation, a concept of his duties as a subject, and not from any particularly aggressive tendencies. This is, perhaps, the most fundamental lesson of our study. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents of a terribly destructive process. With numbing regularity, good people were seen to knuckle under the demands of authority and perform actions that were callous and even severe. Men who are in everyday life responsible and decent were seduced by the trappings of authority, by the control of their perceptions, and by the uncritical acceptance of the experimenter's definition of the situation into performing harsh acts." This situationist approach is considered to be one of the legitimate viewpoints in debates about how to best explain the Holocaust. However, Mayor Fisher wrote in a Washington Post book review in 1996, that she believes Milgram's approach does not provide a fully adequate explanation of what happened. While it may account for some of the more mundane, dutiful destructiveness of the dispassionate bureaucrats who may have shipped Jews to Auschwitz with the same degree of routineness as shipping potatoes to Bremenhaven, it falls far short when one tries to apply it to the more zealous, inventive, and hate-driven atrocities that were also characterized within the Holocaust. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the content within this video, please be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. As well, if you have any criticisms for me on how I could do things better in the future, be sure to leave those below as well. I think it's important to remember, for some of the people I know are going to say that experiments like this should never have been done and that nobody should be psychologically harmed during the procedures of an experiment and things like that. And during this time, people didn't really think about the psychological implications of the things they did very much. I mean, people still believed it was okay to drink a bunch and hate your wife and your kids and stuff, and it wouldn't have any negative effect on them. We think of this stuff as common knowledge today, but one of the only reasons we know these things is because people did these sort of things, and by observing what happened, we discovered they were wrong, and we spread that information so that everybody would know and not do it in the future. It's like how there's some rules that you think, what are these there for? Until you actually get into a situation where that rule applies, and then you realize, oh, well, that's what that's there for. If you guys like these kinds of videos and you're new to this channel, I make them about once a week on various topics, dark experiments, cool events around the internet, crimes that shaped history, that sort of stuff. Just really random documentaries on things I find interesting. So if you guys would like to stick around and see some more of those, please be sure to do so. If you guys have any cases that you'd like me to cover in particular, you can find links to all of my social media in the description below. You can send me a message on any of those, and I will take your ideas into account and try to incorporate them into future videos if I can. A special thanks to my graphics artist, Sabelle. Her links to her social media will be in the description below. She did the thumbnail for this video, and for most of these weekly videos like this. Also, special thanks to my editor, Kim. Links to her social media will be in the description below as well. If you like this kind of content, I also have two other channels, Mr. Blue Skies and Darkest Hour, where I do true crime documentaries and documentaries on disasters that have happened throughout human history as well. You guys can go ahead and check those out, or if you are interested in that sort of thing, they'll be in the description below. Overall, I think that's all for now though, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.